Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name's Paul, and today we're taking a look at the Sofirn SP31 version 3. First of all, just a quick thank you to Sofirn for sending this along. This was provided for review, however they did not provide any monetary compensation, and they had no input into the outcome of this review or any early access to it. That said, it does obviously detach me monetarily from the product, and I do my best to make sure that doesn't affect my overall review. First of all, let's go ahead and jump into a design overview of this little guy and a size comparison. So for size, we have our normal 91mm Swiss Army knife up top and a 58mm down below. And as this is a torch or flashlight, whichever you prefer, we have a AAA and a AA battery. And we all know you've been waiting for the hashtag girth comparison. Now this is an 18650 light, so it seems relevant we should compare it to an 18650 cell and girth. And then in the hand, overall, it's a very compact light, but still protrudes easily for access to the button and for the front to throw light. Getting into the design itself, we have a dual switch arrangement with a mechanical clicky in the back and a side button with a status LED in the middle for the mode selection. Up front, we have a tier style optic. As you can see, we have some protective wings around the side of the button. This does allow the light to tail stand, and also does provide some lanyard hole access whilst being relatively discreet. And we have a pocket clip that is deep in design, but due to placement is going to expose roughly this much of the light overall. There you go. The jimping itself is extremely grippy, and the anodization of the aluminium is, or aluminum, depending on where you're from, is very high quality. It has a matte texture to it, and we have some thermal fins here. And around the back we have a rubber cover protecting the USB-C charging port. For disassembly purposes, this is actually a head rather than a tail unscrew. As you can see, we have an O-ring providing that IP68 water resistance and nice deep threads. And then we have a, let me see if I can show you that off a little bit easier. We have a dual spring setup. Now, dual springs means that it's going to be much harder to actually break the connection rather than a normal standard terminal point. Basically, if you drop a light that only has a single spring, what can happen is the light bounces against the spring and then the light turns off because the electrical circuit has been broken. But when you have two springs, they're kind of always pushing the cell from both sides, and then just makes that less likely to happen. And that threading is very high quality indeed, does give you a lot of confidence in the waterproof rating of this light. Now jumping on into the brightness levels and runtime, feel free to pause if you would like to read this easier. First of all, we have a moonlight mode of 1 lumen that will last for a whopping 550 hours, a low mode of 15 lumens for 120 hours, a medium of 5 hours 50 minutes at 300, and a high of 900 lumens at 2 hours 10 minutes with a turbo mode of 2000 lumens that will last for 5 minutes before stepping down to 800 lumens for a further 1 hour 55 minutes. And then our strobe and beacon modes operate at 2000 lumens, whilst the SOS operates at a much lower 300, presumably for runtime reasons. And I'll go into the UI next, but if you want to see the UI flowchart, you can just pause there. And now for the UI, this is a dual switch setup, so we have on-off operated by the rear tail clicky there. Although this does also offer momentary on without full click, which is something I'm a big fan of. And once clicked on, you have the side switch, which will just let you step through most of the main modes, with the exception of moonlight mode. Now, to get into that moonlight mode, you actually have to hold the side switch whilst you turn on the light, and that'll get you that low moonlight. I'm not super a fan of that, just being a little bit of a two-handed operation, but I can appreciate having something like Moonlight Mode separated out from the main UI, as it might not be commonly used by everybody. Now, to get into the other modes such as Beacon, Strobe, SOS, and this will be a flashing warning, so if you're sensitive to that, feel free to skip ahead in the video or just look away for a little bit. You actually just push and hold the side, and then once you're in a mode, you can just step through from Strobe to SOS, now take us to Beacon, and then back to Strobe, and you can long press just to get back to the main modes. UI overall being very straightforward. With that said, let's go ahead and jump into the pros of the SP31 V3 with a quick disclaimer. Now, first, a disclaimer that I feel like I have to throw out there is that the overall essence of this light isn't really for me, and that is that this whole two switch setup with a rear mechanical clicky rather than an electronic switch and a side switch, it's just not something that really jives with me. However, it's such a prominent UI across different manufacturers, then rather than it being kind of a UI misstep, I think this is just a category of light. And this is an example by Workhorse that I've reviewed on the channel previously, the TD04, that I think that it's just a version of a flashlight that it's just not for me personally, but I recognize that it might suit other people's preference or their use cases. And so I'm going to try and review this with that in mind. That kind of separate UI is not really for me. I prefer something like an electronic tail switch with the Olight series that they do for their Warriors. I think that's very flexible, where you can have the rear switch dedicated to like tactical functions, and then the side switch is more typical Olight UI for like EDC purposes. I think that's a very good split. However, again, I recognize that this is too pervasive to just be a UI quirk. I think this is just a version of a flashlight UI that just doesn't personally gel with me. So whilst I may mention that later on as a bit of a personal negative, if you're interested in this kind of light, obviously that's going to be a pro, or at least very neutral for you. So let's go ahead and jump into the pros. First up, I have to say that for a 18650 rear tail switch, particularly non-electronic switch light, this is very compact. It's actually very pleasant. This is not a large light by any standards, and having being a little bit of an EDC grandpa in some ways, I'm used to this kind of thing being thicker, but needlessly long. Insert whatever joke you want there, but this is very easily carryable, pocketable, while still being long enough that it protrudes from the hand effortlessly for use. And that being said, if you want to see any of the beam shots for this guy, then you can just go ahead and click up here. With every flashlight review, there is a separate beam shot short showing off the beam patterns. And the beam pattern for this guy is nice. It's very throwy thanks to that T-style optic. However, it's got a nice amount of flood, where you can definitely punch into the distance, but you can still use it for other applications. That said, I do think it leans more into the throwing category enough that I think it would be well suited to pair alongside a different EDC option, perhaps a smaller light like this Lumetop EDC01, so that you have a floodier close-up option, and then you have the more intense thrower option for when you need it. Next up, the build quality of this guy is excellent. The anodization feels great. It feels like an absolute tank. And the dual spring setup does mean that if you were to drop it, it does give confidence that you're not going to suddenly lose a black flashlight in the dark. Other things I like about this is that you do have these rear wings to help protect from accidental activation, but it does also allow tail stand, and being able to just put a light down so that it can ceiling bounce and light up a room is just more useful. And even if you have a light that tends more tactical like this, I find having that kind of function just makes it more valuable for more people. The momentary on is also great, and just the quality of this switch. The rubber cover is nicely fitted, and whilst it has a decent amount of travel, it does feel that it's actually a very high quality switch, and I have a lot of faith in it that it can still be activated with gloves on, despite being a more protected version. And the final pro is the price. I believe this retails around $30, and just Sofirn lights in general tend to deliver outstanding value, especially considering the build quality of it, and the fact that it comes with modern USB-C recharging. I just gotta say it is definitely a solid value option that's not going to break the bank and give you a good tactical-esque EDC option. Now into the cons, and let's start off with that USB-C recharging. I do like having the option to recharge it via cable, that's great. However, in terms of protecting that port, I'm not a huge fan of flaps. It is a point of failure, it is something that can come off, deteriorate, break, and it is something that is fiddly to put back. And when something is fiddly to put back or can get caught, it does reduce the overall protection of the port. You can see, as this is an example, you might think that's closed, but it's not actually tucked in, and as the rubber just slowly pops back up, it does leave that port a little bit more liable to get exposed. That's a very minor thing, and I don't think that for most people it'll be an issue, but in terms of protecting ports, these kind of covers, they're not the best thing. Secondly, there's no instant access to turbo as far as I can see, whilst you can get directly into Moonlight mode with how it's separated. There's no way for you to double press or anything like you might typically do to get into turbo. Instead, you just kind of cycle through all of the UI normally, which if you were to use this for a tactical application, it's not great, and generally speaking, I do like UI shortcuts, so it's a shame, and I would like to see that as well. And finally, this split button UI where you have to turn it on back here, but then you're actually controlling it up here. Now, obviously, this has a lot of hand changing and just unpleasantness for me personally, in my opinion. But again, I recognize that it's such a common control scheme that it very clearly has a purpose. Not entirely clear what that purpose is, and I'm sure that some people definitely prefer it this way. So if that's for you, great. Just for me personally, I have to put that in a little bit of a negative. But that said, overall, my final thoughts are this is an excellent light. And despite the fact that I'm not a fan of this UI, just the build quality and how compact it is for still retaining that power means that I actually have found myself carrying this when I thought I wouldn't, particularly because I do enjoy a tail switch with momentary on, and mechanical switches do that very well. You can do it with e-switches as well, but there's just something nice and reassuring about a mechanical switch, and when it's done as well as this is, it is very compelling and does worm its way into your pocket even when you think it might not. That's just what I think. What do you think of the SP31 V3? Could it use a catchier name? Possibly. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below, as well as any other Sofirn lights you'd like me to check out. Whilst you're down there, I'd appreciate a subscribe and like. It does help the channel grow greatly. And if you'd like to support the channel more directly, please consider a channel membership, Patreon, or a donation via Coffee, as it does help put new items on the channel for review. That's just it. Until next time, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.